Hello, and thank you for watching this presentation about navigating fundraising and development during COVID-19. Today, we'll be speaking directly to youth sports and sports organizations because as a fundraising council, Cogeo understands how deeply impacted your organization has been and will continue to be because of the COVID crisis. I'm Melissa, Cogeo's Director of Marketing, and I'll be introducing you to Cogeo as well as your speaker today, Rob Roussel. Cogeo Sports specializes in youth sports and sports-related 501c3 fundraising and organizational sustainability. Its work within the client partners spans multiple sports within the nonprofit industry and geographical regions of the United States. The Cogeo management team has over 50 years of fundraising experience and has raised over $650 million for more than 150 501c3 nonprofit organizations. Executive management were involved at elite sporting levels, both at soccer players and coaches. And now I'll hand it over to Rob.
Thanks, Mel. So the first slide, number 3, outlines the goals and context for today. So we're going to evaluate, we're going to create an action plan, and then we're going to look at roles. Evaluation, really understanding which tools and structured processes need to be provided to objectively evaluate your club or academy or organization's resiliency and ability to navigate this challenging period. We know that there's been a stress on membership dues, and what we also know is that those of our clients that are in the process of raising funds are finding it really helpful in terms of supplementing income, not having to lay off as many coaches or trainers, if any, or furlough for that matter. An action plan. So provide a framework for an activity-driven plan of action prioritizing funding for your club for the next year. And this should be done in bite-sized pieces. We'll talk about that today, given that we know that the majority of clubs or academies are not doing much in terms of fundraising, or at least good fundraising, that they should be in terms of considering. And then roles, their understanding of who needs to be involved and how to successfully execute the plan. The next slide represents Stanford University Graduate School of Business's survey on leadership and management and the challenges facing leadership and management in the 501c3 sector industry. And it turns out the top 2 areas of struggle are in fact board governance, which is finding and keeping the right board members to ensure success, and then funding, gaining funding, which is real work. Therefore, it's challenging. So there's no surprise here. So the point here is that you really do need expertise, given that we know that boards find it challenging because they just don't have that intellectual property that it takes to do business development in the 501c3 arena. The next slide. What are we going to look at today? What topics? Well, we're going to look at really just 5 areas: annual and membership giving, events, corporations and foundations, major gifts, and then stewarding, making sure that you're stewarding at every single capacity. We'll also look at leadership and understanding the role of leadership and the composition of leadership as it relates to the executive director, CEO, and the board of directors and board of trustees. So next slide, number 6, focuses on evaluation of leadership. Right. Do you have, 1, the right board structure, 2, the right governance structure in terms of, are they meeting often enough, or are they addressing the right topics? And the most important is, do you have the right membership on your board? And the scientific method of thinking about how to build a board is very straightforward. It's, okay, let's look at the strategic imperatives facing the club beyond just running teams and tournaments, but really the macro imperatives as it relates to facilities, as it relates to the pay-to-play model and financial aid, as it relates to professional development for the coaches, as it relates to equipment. There's a refresher rate on goals, for example. That's not cheap. And also as it relates to technology and bring more and more technology into sport. And so those qualities are really important to find in board members who are actually should be paying attention much to what's happening in terms of programs. That's really the executive director and the staff's role, but rather looking at how the club can grow and really sustain itself over time, given the consolidation that we're seeing and the rapid change in terms of leagues and structures, particularly at the elite level, that's happening as we speak. But generally speaking, the full board really is represented by the president, the vice president, the secretary, the treasurer, and then you've got a number of at-large members, and board size can really vary, it depends. And then emeritus board members or lifelong board members who may or may not have a vote. And then generally speaking, the subcommittees that we see in terms of standing subcommittees, which is the executive committee, the board governance committee, which oversees bringing board members on, retaining board members, and making sure that they're doing the right thing while they're board members. Development committee, finance committee, and facilities committee. But now I'm going to ask you a question, and I'll give you the answer toward the end of the slide. But of these 5 subcommittees, standing subcommittees, which is by far the most important? Again, I'll repeat the question. Of the 5 standing subcommittees, which is the most important? And then to your right, you've got the ad hoc committees, which can be staffed by both board members and also other non-board volunteers. And these are generally committees that are addressing a specific area, specific tactic that needs outside expertise and more resources. A good example would be in a capital campaign, we impose a steering committee for the capital campaign beyond just the board of directors. And that can be staffed with past board members, key parents, key community leaders, and others. Generally, these ad hoc committees are time limited. They're very project-based and specifically focused in an area of interest. So the key becomes creating a board matrix, and we'll talk about that at the very end of this webinar. But that is a very useful tool where you actually make sense of what the qualities of your current board are, see where the gaps are. So you identify intellectual property gaps, make sure that you're identifying and recruiting key leaders that possess those intellectual property gaps. And the answer to the question, back to the standing committees, on which of the 5 subcommittees that we see the most is the most important by far? And the answer is Board Governance Committee, only because that's the committee that's tasked with bringing on the right qualities and staffing the other subcommittees. The Executive Committee, by default, are the 4 key members of the board and the Executive Director. The next slide is really evaluating what are you doing, right? And remember, this is a bottom-up operation, right? All of you have websites, so you're doing PR. All of you are probably doing some sort of social media, particularly in this day and age where you have to. E-newsletters, and then maybe a virtual annual report posted online. So most clubs that we see are actually doing a good job in terms of marketing themselves, really communicating to their membership, and leveraging social media. And then it's sort of, for the most part, again, it's sort of throwing spaghetti at the wall. Maybe doing an event, maybe doing some kind of approach to a foundation. That's really much, that's it. Maybe increasing dues for a special field project or something. But there's no real consensus yet on that the entire sector needs to be doing professional fundraising, much like the schools and the universities, who also, by the way, do charge exorbitant tuition, yet they're able to raise millions and millions of dollars every year. Why? Because they've been paying attention to this for multiple generations now. It's sort of built into the process. And those of you who have attended college know this because you're now being solicited by your college. You know exactly what that feels like. So the key questions you need to ask is, you need to understand your donor membership intelligence. And particularly in your case, members, right? How many members do you have in your database in terms of communication and outreach? And that obviously changes year to year. given that you're signing new players, bringing in new families. So this needs to be really, really done in a very aggressive way in terms of making sure that you've got the right data. Can you segment your community? In other words, differentiate from parents, past parents, grandparents, if you have them in there, community members, business owners, etc. The message should be different in terms of development. And then, do you even have a CRM database that's focused on outreach? Many of the clubs obviously have their sports-related databases, but here we're talking about something like Salesforce.com, a free product, one of the best, where a 501c3 can apply and obtain up to 12 licenses, a great CRM system. And all of the clubs that we sign, most of whom do not have this, we essentially implement that for them on their behalf and put them on Salesforce, and it works really well. Do you have any form, as I mentioned earlier, are you throwing spaghetti at the wall and just doing one-off things here and there? Or are you trying to formalize House of Development programs, which is to say, formalize annual giving program, events that actually make sense in terms of being mission-centric and having a decent return on investment? And we'll talk about that, how that relates to the sports sector. Are you approaching local foundations that may actually support the type of work you do in the community, which is, youth, essentially, which is big in these days? And then corporations and small businesses. And we'll get into more detail on each of these areas, and I'll talk about 4 types of corporations and how they differ from each other from a development standpoint and approaches. Next slide, number 8. Individuals, retail annual giving. Now, here's the interesting thing. As clubs and academies and organizations, you have a big advantage, and that is that you're dealing with youth. And what we know from development and philanthropy is that parents care about, and grandparents, really 3 things: their health, right? The money they make or that they have available, and then their kids and their kids' well-being, right? If they have children, in your case, they do because you've got kids in the club. And the other advantage you have is that you have good data, right? You have really good data on the families that you're servicing as members. You know their home addresses. And so what we've seen when we've done well screening of our clients that are member clubs, it's been fascinating to see the number of super wealthy families that exist in the club, about which the club administration knew nothing about from this standpoint. So that's the good thing, is that any kind of nebulism or unknown factors within the membership immediately becomes clear upon doing a well screening. We just did a couple for some West Coast clients, and one of the well screens turned out a family whose net worth was $2 billion. And they had an inkling that there was something there, given the father, in this case's notoriety. But to see that number live was staggering to them. So well screening is critical for clubs because they have affinity toward what you're doing for the most part. They can be engaged, and now you actually would know what their actual wealth is, and philanthropic habits for that matter. I mentioned this earlier, really, once you've got your database set, you want to segment it to make sure that the messaging is accurate for the various constituencies to whom you're messaging. I mentioned community leaders, parents, past parents, grandparents, other family members, etc. What we find in sports is best to plan each retail campaign, and a maximum 3 to 4 a year, seasonally, and to focus on various areas. Financial aid is a really good one, right? Socioeconomic equity is a big deal right now, for the most part. Now, it's not going to resonate with everybody, but that's part of fundraising development. You're trying to really maximize on as many as you can, not all. We also find that professional development for coaches can be powerful. If you have a specific product need or equipment need, that's not in the hundreds of thousands, that can be effective. So a new set of goals for $5,000, for example, that would be a good campaign within a campaign. And then you want to execute these retail giving campaigns and then acknowledge the gifts. And if you see a major gift come in, something that's nice, then you want to make sure you develop an individual relationship with those individuals. And I'll talk about major gifts and size of major gifts in a little bit. And then you want to have an active stewardship schedule. So as gifts come in, not just the email receipt that automatically gets generated, but definitely a note from the executive director, the director of coaching, or even the coach of the youth whose parents just made a contribution, and really touch them beyond if you're using email marketing and if you're using an online, which is where most people give these days. Make sure you're doing more than just the auto receipt. And then obviously we mentioned Salesforce and CRM. Be sure that you're incorporating all of your data, all of your hits, anything that's happening into your CRM so that future generations and future leaders within the club can have access to it. It's really important. The next slide, events. Now, what we've not seen is a full suspension of events during this pandemic, but rather a paradigm shift to virtual or outdoor themed events. And so virtual cultivation events are just like regular offline cultivation events. You find a host or two, they then invite, you identify key guests who are invited to attend a virtual meeting from 6 to 7:30. And the same systems occur where the executive director gives an overview with the board chair. The hosts say how excited they are to be hosting, and then maybe you have some programmatic descriptions and anything that has to do with understanding, getting a better understanding of why the community needs to really get behind the agency. So that can work through any platform like WebEx or Zoom. And then the other thing we're seeing are outdoor themed events that respect social distancing guidelines. It just got postponed earlier today, but one of our clubs in Springfield, Missouri, for example, was going to do a soccer golf tournament. But things have gone bad in Missouri, July 9th, and so we're going to postpone it to the fall. But that's a great example of soccer golf where you set up a course and you invite families in and you have hole sponsors, businesses sponsor holes, and it's a great way to make incremental revenue for everybody to have fun. Again, if you do these events, make sure you have a strong stewardship schedule in terms of thanking folks for either their attendance or their contributions or both. And make sure you document everything that occurs in this house, in this room of the house, within the CRM system. It's as important. Next slide. Major gifts. This is probably the easiest things for clubs to do immediately, given the technologies that are available. And it's really, it can be launched in 3 months. Any club, any academy can have a robust major gift program launched within a 3-month time frame. We've seen it, we're doing it, and it can be very, very powerful in terms of incremental revenue generation. I touched on well screening earlier. Our partner in the process is Windfall Data, based out of the West Coast, and they've developed incredible algorithms that really allow us to screen as many records as we want in a batch. So it's very, very accurate and extremely easy and non-time intensive. So for example, we did a well screening for one of the USA's Olympic governing bodies. They had 250,000 plus members, which we were able to screen and get results within 10 days. And the results were staggering in terms of they're now having an understanding of where their high wealth was around the country. Once that well screening is done, it's basically prioritized the list for you in terms of major gift engagement, literally top down, with the wealthiest at the top, all the way down to $1 million. If the net worth of the household is $1 million, it would show up within the Wellscreen results. So it's very scientific, and again, it takes all of the guesswork out of the process. Then once you've identified and created a case statement, and you're ready to go with a steering committee that's engaged beyond the administrative staff, then we start engaging. And engaging as in meetings, one-to-one meetings, really just talking to people about the plans for the club as it relates to whatever is being attempted to raise from a financial standpoint, whether it's financial aid, whether it's facilities, anything really. You execute meetings, and really that's super easy in terms of just, thanks for taking the meeting. We really want you to consider, as you can see from the case statement, we've got big projects, and we really want you to consider making a meaningful gift toward this project at whatever level you're comfortable. And that's an easy way to make an ask. Another way to make an ask is, Shirley and John, we want you to consider this year and the next 4 or 5 year pledge a gift of $5,000 each year. And why can you go in confidently and say this to Shirley and John? Because you've got the data, the Wellscreen data, and you know their net worth is such and that they've given at such levels, if not more elsewhere. Therefore, now you've got the confidence. And what we do is once our clients obtain a meeting of this caliber, we then do the analysis and we script them and we say, exactly, in this case, you want to ask for a gift at whatever level they're comfortable. In this case, we want you to ask for $100,000 over 5 years. So whatever we determine is right is what happens. And then the most important question, however, is not the ask. That's easy, right? It's then once they've engaged, regardless of the response, whether it's yes, maybe, or no, because they took the meeting, therefore they're interested, they may have a good network. So you want to ask them, even though you have the data on the Wellscreen, you want to ask them, hey, who do you know out there? Who might you help us triangulate into or have this kind of meeting? Don't need an answer now. I want you to go home and think about this, talk to your wife, and make sure that you get back to us on this. Be sure that I'll be getting back to both you and Susie about this, because it's really critical that we get as many people involved in this as possible. And that's really organic growth, because we know from a longitudinal study that was conducted at the turn of the century by Penelope Burke, she concluded that, this was her major conclusion, it was a study done of habits of major donors in Canada and the United States, across the entire industry. And her main takeaway was the only way to new donors in major gifts, incremental new donors, is through existing donors, which is true. So what the post meeting will do is that because you're talking about networking, it'll unlock additional channels, and it's really just like a pyramid scheme. It's an organic incremental growth over time, given that they then might produce, that couple might produce another 4 couples. Well, that might produce 3 visits or 2 visits. Well, those 2 visits or 3 visits might produce another 8 or 9 visits, right? So you can see how it layers out very effectively. And then, of course, very aggressive stewardship schedule. Because these are larger gifts, in terms of how we steward them, what we like to do is to break it into quarters. And so say somebody gives a gift of $2,000 one year, divided by 4, $500. And let's say the gift is made in July 10th, so tomorrow. Then obviously they would get a thank you note right away the following week. And then in October, they would get a note saying, hey, by the way, the $500 that represents a quarter of your gift allowed us to do this, this, and this. And then in January, they would get another letter saying, hey, this quarter, your $500, we did this. It's great. And then in April, we would send the last letter and say, hey, this is great. We were able to do this, this, and this. And then in June, then we would approach them with an email and basically say, hey, we'd love to meet with you to talk about your giving for next year. Why in June? Because remember, the gift came in July. You want to set up the scenario for the following year if it's not a multi-year pledge. Now, what is the size of a major gift, right? Because every organization has a different budget. And so in the case of a club, because there's no history of development for the most part, what we say is whatever the overall size of the budget is, so if a club has a $500,000 budget or a $2 million budget, what a major gift is 1/1000th of that budget. So if it's a $500,000 budget for the entire year for the club, then at $500 is a major gift. Because if you get 1,000 of those, you've made up the entire budget. $2 million budget, $2,000 is a major gift. That's how they get defined. Next slide on corporations. To be sure, I mentioned earlier in the webinar that there are 4 types of corporations, and I'm going to enumerate them now because each of them is a little bit different in terms of how you need to approach them and thinking about charitable giving and tax breaks, as well as contextually how they operate, given what type of corporation they might be. So the simplest corporations are LLCs, limited liability company, generally run by one entity, a couple or an individual, and therefore you've got a sole decision maker, much like you would with a high net worth individual and a major donor. And they need to be literally treated like a major donor, right? Because they're giving from their company and they're getting the same tax break, more or less, that an individual would get. S Corp, also generally owned by one entity, and very similar in terms of tax structure. And then the third, that's not complex, is limited liability partnership, right? Which is then, unlike corporate, it's got more than one owner, but it's a partnership. So you've got 2+ decision makers in the pipeline. And the way to approach them generally is to find one champion, one of the partners who really believes if you can get several partners, and that's fantastic. But one partner who can actually then be the messenger, the trusted messenger to the rest of the company in terms of engagement. That seems to be the best way to do it. The fourth type of company, no surprise here, is a C Corp. These are larger companies, generally shareholder driven, and they're very much profit driven. Now we're seeing the emergence of B corporations, which are more socially aware. So we can't forget about B Corps because they're going to become, we think, more and more relevant as time goes on. But they're not a dominant player now. So I will actually amend my statement to say that there are literally 5 types of corporations, including now B Corps. C Corps are the 800-pound gorillas, right? The Targets, the Walmarts, the you name it, Costco, etc. These are large banks. And generally they're run with shareholder-driven value and profit incentivized corporation. Many of them do have a community outreach arm, increasingly so, and increasingly are looking for visibility in terms of do-gooders in the community and want to be associated. What we found with the sport is that the healthcare industry has been synergistic. Hospitals, orthopedic chains, and on and on. So the healthcare is clearly interested. Banking as well, because obviously with the Community Reinvestment Act, CRA, they have to give back to the nonprofit sector a certain percentage of their profits. It varies by state every year. So banks actually are relevant to all clubs and academies as it relates to both C Corps, large banks like the Bank of America, Wells Fargo, etc., but also regional banks and community banks, as well as federal credit unions, all of whom are under that kind of behavior guideline, which is a Community Reinvestment Act, and you can read about it on the internet. So I just wanted to give you that preface so that you understand the 5 types of corporations and the best approach. That way now it's no longer, oh, a corporation, how do I deal with it? No, you understand, if it's an LLC, it's really one individual or a couple. And it's really obtaining a meeting with Claire, who will then make the decision on behalf of the LLC. So before you get going, you want to audit any prior activity, right, over the last 5-6 years. Who have you been engaging in terms of sponsors, uniform sponsors, field sponsors, team sponsors, any kind of equipment, in-kind sponsors, food. Just do a serious audit, no matter how small the gift or the in-kind activity, to get a sense of who out there is already supporting you or has supported you. Because you're going to treat them like major donors, right? And go after them and then say, hey, what other of your friends at the Chamber of Commerce might be interested in engaging with us? Determine return on investment metrics. What are they interested in? What do they want to see? And can they transact a donation, or do they want to do a sponsorship and get something out of it? So you need to be very, very clear in what you're going to offer in terms of sponsorship. And we've got great examples. Just be in touch with Mel if you want some great example on how to present sponsorship value to a particular corporate sponsor. Your case statement in this case needs to be super ROI specific. And for most clients, we actually do a bit of a variance for corporate case statement, only because they're looking for very much what's in it for me as a corporation. Corporations are run by people, and therefore it's key to triangulate into the corporation at the very highest level, if at all possible. And they're treated like high net worth individuals, and they just happen to run a large corporation or a business or whatever. And we find that with clubs, particularly clubs with members whose families have parents who run small businesses, those are generally very, very productive meetings. I've been on several before the pandemic occurred around the Midwest, where I did a tour of clients, and those were the most powerful meetings we had. Post-meeting follow-up, again, treat them like major donors. They will like that, and you will look better than anybody else they're giving to if you're doing a good job in terms of active stewardship. And much like a major donor, if they are investing heavily, give them quarterly updates. If you've got a sponsor, at a minimum, you should be in touch with them every month, particularly if they're a big sponsor. And I'm talking about formally in touch. Obviously, there's some informal touches that will occur, but that's really important to understand as well. And then make sure it gets into your CRM system. Any activity needs to be tracked. The next slide, foundations. Again, as we onboard clients, we note immediately that they've done no work with foundations for the most part, which is really a shame because foundations are growing as baby boomers are getting older. They're being set up. Community funds are growing. Community foundations are growing, and they've got to give away the money, right? And why wouldn't they consider you as a club, given the great work you're doing in the community, as long as it's framed correctly? So foundations are actually a strong potential source of revenue for clubs, academies, organizations around the country, and we've uncovered that. If you've done work with foundations, make sure, much like with corporations and businesses, that you audit all prior activity, everything, in a spreadsheet, who are the names, contacts, etc. And by the way, there's lots of turnover in foundations, unfortunately. So the key is to keep track of that turnover. And then with your case statement, you identify funding areas to pursue, right? Then you perform foundation research through the Foundation Center online to understand which area foundations, regional foundations, exist, and then which have, over time, supported youth and educational and health activities, health-related activities. So these are good because you've got broad search words that are actually inclusive. You then prioritize research because you will uncover several, if not many, foundations regionally that might be a good fit. The prioritization should occur from a top-down reality, which are giving the most and which have the highest synergies. And then much like with corporations, you want to immediately, as soon as you've identified 4, 5, 1, 2, whatever number of foundations, you get a list of their current board of directors, which you then pass on to your board of directors and other community leaders that you know well to see if anybody has a relationship with 1 or 2 of the board members. That way you can actually bring that proposal or bring the preview to the proposal to the board member who may choose to champion it to the rest of the board. And therefore, you'll have an active, trusted, maverick individual who would say, yep, I support this. This is something we need to consider seriously as a board. That'll give you the highest success rate possible. On the other hand, if you cannot find anyone who knows a board member, and that's not uncommon, then you need to connect directly, you meaning the executive director, director of coaching, campaign chair, with the program officer or the executive director of the foundation. Once you've had that conversation, and then you need to submit the proposal application. Most of it is done online now. And if in fact you are accepted, then you do a major gift type stewardship, because generally speaking, foundation gifts can be higher, and the quarterly stewardship will pay huge dividends because other of their fundees most likely will not be doing that. And they may submit a form thank you, and that'll be it until they get their next grant, which is a massive mistake. So in this case in particular, because foundations, if you think about it, they're in the business of giving away money. Therefore, they're in the business of tracking what their money's doing. So if you can tell them what their money's doing, you're gonna look really, really good. So that's why I'm really emphasizing this yet again. And make sure you track all of the activity in CRM, because this is big money potentially, and good money, and money that renews itself. They don't have, let's put it this way, there's not much of an ego within a foundation, right? There's no emotion. They don't have kids in the club who are not making the elite team. So it's just a lot easier, right? And generally speaking, unlike corporations, all they really want is that quarterly report. Many of them have it in their guidelines in terms of how you will need to behave if in fact you become a fundee. Okay, next slide. Now we talked about leadership and what it should look like, right? And how the leadership should be structured, and what type of leadership you would need in terms of matching the strategic imperatives from an intellectual property standpoint within your leadership. So let's assume you have that now. So now you want to do optimization, right? To engage them in fundraising activity, because it's not their job; they're volunteers, right? The job is the administration. It's the executive director, the director of coaching, and the executive staff to really make sure that things are moving forward in partnership with a consultant. And we strongly advise that all clubs, if you get into this type of activity, that you bring on a consultant, whether it's us or someone else, because there just will not be the expertise that you will need to make sure that you pull it off. And so how do you engage them in activity? Well, you get them comfortable. You make it clear to them that we're not asking you to ask for money. Because if, as a board member, if you're asking somebody, they may say, yeah, sure, I'll give to your club, but hey, I'm on the board of the YMCA. You need to give to that. That's called blowback. No, the ask is going to be made by the executive director. That's her role. You make it clear that really what we're asking them to do is to connect, to help connect and make connection. They can join the executive director on an ask if we think it's smart, but for the most part, it's really about connecting. Beyond the board, we strongly recommend that you create a campaign steering committee, even if you're not in a capital campaign, just a major gift campaign steering committee. And that way you can bring in champion parents. We just put together for a for-profit club in San Francisco. It's San Francisco United Soccer. Big club. So they're for-profit. We just in the last 3 months put together a foundation. So it's the first ever San Francisco United Foundation. And in doing so, we just brought on 8 new board members, all of whom are current parents and community leaders in the city. And it's going to be an incredibly powerful board of directors for the foundation. And I anticipate they will be raising a lot of money. Stay tuned. The campaign starts. We're going to have our first meeting of the board in 2 weeks, and the campaign is going to start August 1, full bore. Look to our Cogeo/case for their case statement, which should come up in the next 2 weeks as well. So you want to engage non-board members, basically, as many people as you can. And again, for San Francisco United, yeah, we're building a board for the foundation, but in parallel, we're also building a steering committee of about 20 individuals. So we've got 8 on the board, another 20 that are lined up to help. So just the leadership alone for this campaign, which is just launching, as I mentioned, they've never raised a dime up until now. We'll have about 28 individuals, not including the 2 key administrators, Mario and Mike. And then the best practices that we see is where there's real accountability, right? Accountability, like every board member needs to bring 2 new individuals a month or 5 a quarter. An entity can be an individual, it could be a corporation, it could be a link to a foundation, a new network, it could be into parks and recreation, into government, potentially. Or you could have an accountability metric, and we see this in operas and most of the fancier arts organization, which is a give or get policy. Give or get $5,000 a year. Some of the higher operas, it's give or get literally $100,000 a year. So that's the extreme. The key is that they make their own gift as board members, so that you can go out to foundations with 100% participation. That's critical, but we take care of that in terms of messaging that. The last thing I'll tell you in terms of what you can do today at the next board meeting to really change the culture, if in fact you're considering development, is put fundraising at the top of the agenda in board meetings, right? Why? Because generally board meetings are at night, in the evening. People have worked a full day and they're tired. That's why rallies are held at night, by the way, these political rallies, forever. They've been doing this literally since 1900. Because people can be more impacted. They're more liable. And board meetings, again, generally are at night or in the evening. And generally fundraising, if at all, even if you're throwing spaghetti at the wall, is at the bottom of the agenda. Nobody wants to talk about it. It's work, right? So it's the only place where you have to work versus just, exchange emails or ideas. So put it at the top of the agenda, even if it's minimal, so that you're basically messaging your board a couple things. One, hey, this is important. You need to pay attention, and we need your engagement. And the other advantage is, if you've got an evening meeting, they'll be fresher at 5:30 than they would be at the end of the meeting at 7:30. So that's why we strongly encourage, and we actually mandate it with our clients, that it go at the top of the agenda. I mentioned the case statement. If you go to cogeo.us/case, there's some awesome examples, up to 20 different case statements, many of which are sports related, from governing bodies to Chicago Lions Rugby to Wilmington Youth Rowing Association, basketball with Empower Me Academy in San Francisco, and then a number of, you'll see clubs and academies across the country in soccer. I think USA Triathlon is up there. I think USA Wrestling is up there. So it's really interesting. So eclectic, right? Different sports, different sectors, different groups even. But the net is each of the case statement, and look at the non-sports one. You'll see arts organizations. You'll see everything, educational institutions. And you'll see how each case statement does essentially the same thing. It provides a mission, a history, an overview. It delineates the programs, and they're sequentially enumerated for the most part. And then it has funding and execution timeline, very concise, funding opportunities and the impact they will make. And then, because leadership is key, right? Projects are all about people. We know that. Everything's about people. Board of director bios, who are the partners, sponsors, and then a number of supporting quotes you'll see in these sample cases, as well as pictures, really vivid pictures. Now, the case statement serves as the basis for the campaign, and then you have supplementary documents that could be videos, it could be one-pagers around a specific project, definitely sponsorship packages, which is completely different from a case statement. So for Chicago Lions Rugby, you'll see the case statement, but we also put together a really attractive sponsorship package comprehensively, with which they've had a lot of success. Anyway, it's all there on the Cogeo website. Check it out. And ask Mel if you have any questions. The final slide, before I pass it on to Mel, which you'll be able to access, and Mel will explain how in a couple minutes, is really about 4 areas. The first, leadership. We're going to give you tools, sample board matrix, so you can have that. And then you can actually access 50 minutes or so board of directors training webinar. Very similar to this type of webinar, but the information is just specific to how to manage a board effectively. Fundraising execution, how to conduct a major gift meeting. Great data there, really granular. Foundation outreach checklist. Are you ready to approach a foundation? All the things you would need to have in hand. And then 3 webinars. One on retail giving, annual giving, which we covered today. So if you want a lot more detail on how to do that, go listen to that. Another on major gifts and what major gifts. Again, very, very detailed. They're both about an hour. And then another on corporations and foundations, also about an hour. Very detailed, and I'll give you expanded knowledge on those 2 areas. And then I mentioned the case statement. You can check out final versions, but you can also take a look and see how we design these for our clients. There's a content template as well as a design template. Very cool stuff. As far as CRM, we've developed a how to register for Salesforce CRM, which, by the way, as I mentioned, is free for 501c3s, up to 12 licenses per agency. Fantastic. And then a real sample development plan. You've been thinking about putting a plan together. We've got one there. And then finally, and I'll pass it back to Mel, if you want to speak to us, and again, I'm not trying to sell here, if you've got some challenges or you're thinking about starting something and you want to speak to us, we'd be happy to do so for whatever amount of time it takes, obviously for free. Okay, Mel, take it from here.
Thanks, Rob. And yes, viewers, please take advantage of these resources. We're very excited to be able to offer these to you for free. As Rob mentioned, we understand that the links aren't available through the video, but we'll make sure that the slides are nearby or attached so you can access these resources. So thank you again for watching, and we wish you nothing but the best during these times. And thank you, Rob, for your time.